Barack Obama finally broke his silence, and the timing could not have been more dangerous. While Donald Trump's war in Iran continued to spiral with no clear end in sight, while gas prices climbed past $4.40 a gallon and threatened to go higher, while the Strait of Hormuz remained a volatile flashpoint, and while Congress sat in recess quietly advancing a $1 billion taxpayer-funded package tied to Trump's personal White House ballroom project, the former president sat down with the New Yorker and spoke with calm, deliberate force. He did not shout. He did not trade insults. He did not chase the daily outrage cycle. He simply reminded the country what leadership is supposed to look like when the costs are real, the chaos is rising, and the people in power appear more focused on personal branding than national consequence. In a few measured sentences, Barack Obama cut through the noise of victory claims, trademark deals, and escalating conflict. He said American leadership must still reflect a basic regard for human dignity and decency, not only within the country's borders, but beyond them. He warned that when those values are abandoned, when hubris and pure self-interest take control, the world can break in ways that are difficult to repair. The words were quiet. The implications were not. At a moment when the administration insisted the war was under total control and the strategic picture was improving, Obama's calm assessment forced a different question into the open. What has this actually cost, and what kind of leadership is producing these results? Donald Trump, meanwhile, continued to describe the campaign in maximal language, the greatest military maneuver, absolute control of the strait, Iran on its knees. Surrogates echoed the talk of checkmate and final victory. Yet the practical reality kept undercutting the rhetoric. Iranian drones still reached oil infrastructure in the region. Maritime traffic remained disrupted. Fuel prices kept climbing and began hitting ordinary Americans and industries already under strain. European partners were being asked for help even as the administration questioned the value of long-standing alliances. The gap between the triumphant messaging and the daily costs was becoming harder to ignore. Into that atmosphere, Obama's intervention landed with unusual weight. He did not need volume. He needed only clarity and the authority of someone who had once resisted the very pressure to launch a full-scale war with Iran that was now defining the current presidency. He noted that he had judged the costs of such a conflict too high during his own time in office. He questioned whether the path now being taken truly served the long-term interests of the United States. And he returned, again and again, to the idea that power without decency and without regard for human consequences is not strength. It is a form of damage that spreads. The domestic picture only sharpened the contrast. While the war continued and prices rose, Senate Republicans advanced funding language that would direct $1 billion towards security features connected to Trump's East Wing ballroom, a project once publicly promised to cost taxpayers nothing. At the same time, a trademark arrangement was moving forward that would put the president's name on Palm Beach International Airport and give his private companies leverage over the merchandise sold under that name. The juxtaposition was difficult to miss. A country absorbing the economic and human costs of a distant conflict was also being asked to underwrite the personal construction and branding preferences of the man directing that conflict. Obama did not catalog every appropriation or every commercial arrangement. He focused on something more fundamental, the claim that the American president still carries a responsibility to embody a baseline of decency and example, and that the abandonment of that responsibility carries consequences far beyond any single news cycle. In a moment dominated by volume, grievance, and claims of total control, the return of a calm, experienced voice stating first principles felt like a direct challenge to the entire style of the current presidency. This is the story of the week. Barack Obama finally spoke, and why his quiet words cut deeper than any shouted attack. One man measured the cost of power and the danger of abandoning decency. The other continued to perform strength while the bill kept growing. The country was left to watch both, and the difference, once seen clearly, was difficult to ignore. The war was supposed to be over. That was the official line, repeated daily with total confidence. Donald Trump and his allies never softened the message. Absolute control of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran on its knees, the greatest military maneuver in American history. Checkmate, victory. Every press appearance, every interview, every Truth Social post carried the same tone. This was already won. The results were historic, and anyone still talking about costs or complications was simply refusing to accept reality. But reality kept pushing back. Iranian drones were still reaching oil infrastructure in the United Arab Emirates. Fires broke out at major ports. 3 Indian workers were injured in one strike. Schools across the UAE switched to remote learning because officials were no longer sure students would be safe. Gas prices in the United States climbed past $4.40 a gallon, and energy analysts warned that if the strait stayed disrupted much longer, the national average could push toward $5. Maritime insurers remained reluctant to cover voyages through the area. Commercial ships moved carefully or stayed away entirely. European partners were being asked to help restore freedom of navigation, the same partners the administration had spent months questioning and, in some cases, alienating. At the same time, thousands of U.S. troops were being pulled out of Germany while Vladimir Putin watched every movement. Ordinary Americans felt the effects directly at the pump. Workers at Spirit Airlines were already out of jobs as jet fuel costs spiked and the airline collapsed under the pressure. This was the messy, expensive reality Barack Obama walked into when he finally broke his silence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need insults or dramatic language. He simply laid the full timeline on the table and left it sitting there like a receipt no one in power wanted to pick up. In 2015, there was a diplomatic agreement that limited Iran's nuclear program and put international inspectors on the ground. It wasn't perfect, but it contained the nuclear issue for years without a single American bomb being dropped. In 2018, Trump tore that agreement up. He called it defective, one-sided, and one of the worst deals ever made. He promised something far better. What followed was years of maximum economic pressure, rising regional tension, and eventually open military conflict. Billions of dollars were spent. American service members died. The Strait of Hormuz, once a relatively stable commercial artery, turned into a daily source of risk, leverage, and uncertainty. And after all of that spending and all of that loss, the strategic situation still looked unresolved. Iran was still capable of striking regional infrastructure. Oil markets were still reacting. The United States was still managing an open-ended conflict with no clean victory in sight. Obama's point was simple and brutal. You discarded a working diplomatic arrangement, launched a war, paid an enormous price in money and lives, and somehow ended up in a worse position than where you started. He reminded the country that he had once faced intense pressure, including direct pressure from Netanyahu, to start exactly this kind of war. He had refused. He judged the cost too high and the long-term benefits too uncertain. Looking at the current results, he suggested those costs were still too high. He didn't hide behind complexity or diplomatic language. He asked the questions the victory speeches kept skipping. Is the United States actually safer now? Is the region more stable? Or did the country spend blood and treasure only to create a larger and more expensive problem? While the war continued to generate costs, the domestic side of the story only made the contrast uglier. Congress was officially in recess, but the real work continued behind the scenes. Senate Republicans advanced a reconciliation package that included $1 billion for security features connected to Trump's East Wing ballroom project, the same project that had been publicly sold as costing taxpayers not a dime. At the same time, a trademark deal was being finalized that would rename Palm Beach International Airport after the president and give his private companies the authority to control which retailers could sell airport-branded merchandise. The president's name would go on a public facility, and his companies would keep commercial leverage over the products sold under that name. War costs rising for regular people, personal construction and branding projects advancing for the man in charge. Obama didn't need to list every appropriation or every commercial clause. The picture was already clear. One side was still performing strength and insisting on total control. The other was calmly pointing at the growing bill and asking why it kept getting larger while the results stayed messy and incomplete. That was the real force of the moment, not a viral insult, not a staged confrontation, just a quiet former president putting the record in chronological order while the current one kept insisting the record didn't matter. The more the administration claimed victory, the more Obama's simple timeline made the victory look hollow. And once the gap between the claims and the actual cost became visible, it became very hard for anyone paying attention to unsee it. The war was supposed to be over, the cost said otherwise. And Obama made sure the country heard both sides of that sentence. While the war kept generating real costs and the victory claims kept getting louder, another story was moving quietly through Washington and Florida, and it made the whole picture look even worse. Donald Trump's personal projects were advancing fast. Congress was officially in recess, but the real work continued behind the scenes. Senate Republicans pushed forward a reconciliation package that included $1 billion for security features tied to the East Wing ballroom. This was the same ballroom that had been publicly sold with a clear promise it would cost taxpayers not a dime. Private donors would cover it. Patriots would step up. That was the line. Now the bill language told a completely different story. Taxpayers were being put on the hook for above ground and below ground security features connected to the president's personal construction project. At the same time, another deal was being locked in. Palm Beach International Airport was moving toward a name change, Donald J. Trump International Airport. Trump's private company had already secured the trademark. The agreement gave his companies the power to control which retailers could sell airport-branded merchandise. The president's name would go on a public facility paid for by the public, and his private companies would keep commercial leverage over the products sold under that name. War costs for regular people, personal branding, and construction for the man in charge. This was the exact backdrop when Barack Obama finally spoke. He didn't need to scream about corruption or list every line item. The picture was already clear enough for anyone paying attention. A country dealing with rising gas prices, thousands of airline workers losing their jobs, and an unresolved military conflict was also being asked to underwrite the president's ballroom upgrades and airport merchandise operation. The contrast didn't require dramatic language. It only required basic honesty. Obama kept the focus on something deeper than any single appropriation or trademark clause. He talked about decency. He talked about the actual responsibility that comes with American power. He said leadership still has to reflect a basic regard for human dignity, not just inside the country's borders, but beyond them. When that standard is thrown away, when pure self-interest takes over, the damage doesn't stay contained. Allies start recalculating their relationships. Authoritarians feel more confident. The international system that once amplified American influence begins to weaken. And no other country is ready or willing to replace the role the United States used to play. That vacuum is real, and it carries consequences. He delivered all of this without raising his voice. He didn't need volume. The facts on the ground were already doing the heavy lifting. Iranian drones were still hitting oil infrastructure. Fuel prices were still climbing. The administration was still claiming absolute control of the strait while simultaneously asking Europe for help. And back home, the political system was still finding quiet ways to move public money and branding opportunities toward the president's personal priorities. The longer this gap stayed visible, between the victory rhetoric and the actual costs, between the public sacrifice and the private enrichment, the harder it became to defend. Obama's quiet intervention didn't create the contradiction. It simply refused to pretend the contradiction wasn't there. That was the real sting of the moment. Not a personal insult, not a partisan rant, not another loud confrontation, just a former president pointing at the growing bill, the war costs, the economic pain, the personal projects, and asking why the people paying it were being told everything was under control and under budget. The war continued. The costs continued, the ballroom funding continued, the airport deal continued, and the calm voice that insisted none of this should be normal kept cutting through the noise. By the end of the week, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Barack Obama had spoken in calm, clear sentences about the real costs of the war, the danger of abandoning basic decency, and the long-term damage that happens when American power is used without restraint or example. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't trade insults. He simply put the timeline and the consequences in order and left them sitting in full public view. Donald Trump and his allies kept doing the opposite. They insisted the war was already won. They claimed absolute control of the Strait of Hormuz. They called it the greatest military maneuver in American history. Any criticism was dismissed as weakness or bad faith. The victory language never slowed down, even as the practical results stayed messy and expensive. But the gap between the claims and the reality kept getting wider. Gas prices remained high and threatened to climb further. Iranian drones were still reaching oil infrastructure. Commercial shipping stayed disrupted. Thousands of airline workers had already lost their jobs as jet fuel costs spiked. European partners were being asked to help restore freedom of navigation, even while the administration questioned the value of those same alliances. At home, the political system continued advancing the president's personal priorities, a $1 billion security package tied to the East Wing ballroom that was once promised to cost taxpayers nothing, and a public airport being renamed after him with his private companies keeping control over the merchandise. One side kept measuring the actual bill. The other kept performing strength and moving personal projects forward. That was the real story of the week. Not a dramatic shouting match on a debate stage. Not a viral personal insult. Just a quiet former president refusing to look away from the costs while the current one refused to acknowledge them. Obama's approach made the contradiction harder to hide. He reminded the country that a diplomatic arrangement had once contained the nuclear issue without war. That arrangement was discarded. A military campaign followed. Billions were spent. Lives were lost. And the strategic situation still looked unresolved and more expensive than the problem it was supposed to solve. He had once resisted pressure to launch this kind of conflict. Looking at the results, he suggested the costs were still too high. He tied it to a larger point. When American leadership abandons any baseline of decency and example, the damage spreads beyond any single battlefield. Allies recalculate. Authoritarians feel emboldened. The system that once amplified American influence begins to weaken. He didn't need to list every appropriation or every trademark clause. The picture was already clear. A country paying the price of an open-ended war was also being asked to underwrite the personal construction and branding preferences of the man directing it. The more the administration claimed total control and historic success, the more the growing list of costs made those claims look hollow. Obama didn't destroy Trump with anger. He didn't need to. He only needed to tell the truth without flinching and let the record sit in public view. Once the country saw the difference, calm accountability on one side, volume and personal enrichment on the other, it became very hard to unsee. The war continued. The costs continued. The ballroom funding continued. The airport deal continued. And the quiet voice that refused to pretend everything was fine kept cutting through the noise. In the end, that may have been the most damaging thing of all. The weeks that followed did not make the moment smaller. They made it clearer. What began as a calm interview and a series of loud victory claims slowly hardened into something larger, a public test of two completely different ways of handling power, cost, and accountability. Barack Obama had refused to look away from the bill. Donald Trump and his allies had refused to accept that the bill even existed. The longer the gap between those two positions stayed visible, the harder it became to pretend the difference was minor. The war continued to generate real consequences. Gas prices remained elevated. Regional infrastructure still took hits. Shipping stayed disrupted. Workers who had lost jobs because of spiking fuel costs were still dealing with the fallout. European partners were still being asked for help, even as the administration questioned the value of the alliances themselves. At the same time, the domestic machinery kept moving on a different track. The $1 billion tied to the East Wing ballroom advanced. The airport renaming and trademark arrangement continued. The president's name and commercial interests kept gaining ground while ordinary costs kept rising. Obama's intervention gained force precisely because it stayed quiet. He did not try to match the volume coming from the other side. He did not need to. He simply kept returning to the same basic points. A diplomatic arrangement that once contained the nuclear issue without war had been discarded. A military campaign had followed. The costs in money and lives had been high, and the strategic results still looked incomplete and more expensive than the problem it was meant to solve. He reminded people that he had once resisted pressure to launch this kind of conflict. Looking at the current results, he suggested the reasons for that resistance still held. He tied it to a larger claim about American power, that leadership without a baseline of decency and example creates damage that spreads far beyond any single battlefield. The administration's response stayed consistent with its earlier pattern. Victory was still being declared. Control was still being asserted. Criticism was still being dismissed. But the practical evidence kept undercutting the language. Every new report of disrupted shipping, rising fuel prices, or continued regional strikes made the gap between the claims and the reality harder to close. Every new detail about taxpayer money moving toward personal projects made the contrast with public sacrifice sharper. That was the lasting effect of the week Obama spoke. It was not a single dramatic confrontation. It was the steady accumulation of visible contradictions. One side kept measuring the costs and asking what had actually been gained. The other side kept performing strength and advancing personal priorities. Once the public could see both approaches operating at the same time, the difference stopped being abstract. It became concrete. In the months that followed, the moment kept resurfacing whenever new costs appeared or new questions were raised about the war's progress. The calm timeline Obama had laid out acted like a measuring stick. Claims of total success had to stand next to the actual record of expenses, losses, and unresolved problems. Claims of strong leadership had to stand next to the image of public money and public institutions being used to advance private branding and construction. The more those comparisons were made, the more difficult it became to maintain the original victory narrative without qualification. Obama did not need to win a daily media battle. He only needed to place the facts in order and refused to look away from them. Trump's side continued to insist the facts were being misrepresented or overstated, but the gap between the two accounts remained. And once a large enough part of the public had seen that gap clearly, It became part of the permanent record of the period. The war continued. The costs continued. The personal projects continued. And the quiet insistence that none of this should be treated as normal continued to echo. In the end, that may have been the most lasting consequence of all. Not a sudden collapse of the narrative, but a slow, steady erosion of its credibility every time the claims of total control met the evidence of ongoing cost. One man had measured the bill. The other had tried to talk past it. The country had watched both, and the difference once seen proved difficult to forget. Time did not soften the moment, it sharpened it. What started as a single calm interview and a wave of loud victory claims slowly turned into a lasting measuring stick. Every new development in the war, every new spike in costs, every new report of personal projects advancing while the public paid the price brought people back to the same contrast. Barack Obama had looked directly at the bill and described it without flinching. Donald Trump and his allies had kept insisting the bill was either exaggerated or already justified by total success. The longer both positions stayed visible, the harder it became to treat them as equal. The war itself refused to deliver the clean ending that had been promised. Fuel prices stayed high. Regional strikes continued. Shipping remained disrupted. Workers who had lost jobs because of the economic fallout were still dealing with the consequences. Allies were still being asked for support even as the administration questioned the value of those relationships. At the same time, the domestic track kept moving in a different direction. Public money continued flowing toward the East Wing Ballroom project. The airport renaming and trademark arrangement continued to lock in commercial advantages for the president's private companies. The pattern was consistent, rising costs for the public, advancing personal priorities for the man in charge. Obama's approach gained power because it never tried to compete on volume. He did not need daily hits or dramatic language. He simply kept returning to the core sequence. A diplomatic arrangement that had contained the nuclear issue without war was discarded. A military campaign followed. The human and financial costs mounted, and the strategic results still looked incomplete and more expensive than the original problem. He reminded the country that he had once resisted pressure to take this path. Looking at the results, he suggested the reasons for that resistance remain valid. He tied it to a larger point about American power, that when leadership drops any baseline of decency and example, the damage spreads. Allies recalculate. Rivals feel emboldened. The system that once multiplied American influence begins to weaken. The other side stayed locked in its original posture. Victory was still being declared. Control was still being asserted. Criticism was still being dismissed as weakness or bad faith. But every new piece of evidence, another disrupted shipping lane, another rise in fuel prices, another story about taxpayer money moving toward personal projects, made the gap between the claims and the record harder to close. The more the administration insisted everything was under control, the more the accumulating costs made that insistence look disconnected from reality. That was the lasting effect. Not a single explosive confrontation, but a slow, steady exposure of two incompatible ways of dealing with power and consequence. One side measured the actual results and asked what had been gained. The other side performed strength and continued advancing personal interests. Once enough people saw both approaches operating at the same time, the difference stopped being theoretical. It became concrete and difficult to dismiss. In the months that followed, the June moment kept resurfacing. Whenever new costs appeared or new questions were raised about the war's progress, Obama's calm timeline acted like a reference point. Claims of historic success had to stand next to the actual record of expenses, losses, and unresolved problems. Claims of strong leadership had to stand next to the image of public resources being used for private branding and construction. The more those comparisons were made, the more the original victory narrative lost altitude. Obama did not need to dominate the daily news cycle. He only needed to place the facts in order and refuse to look away. The other side continued to insist the facts were being distorted. But the gap between the two accounts remained visible. And once a significant part of the public had seen that gap clearly, it became part of the permanent record of the period. The war continued, the costs continued, the personal projects continued, and the quiet demand that none of this should be accepted as normal continued to carry weight. In the end, the most damaging outcome was not a sudden collapse of the narrative. It was the slow erosion of its credibility every time the claims of total control met the evidence of ongoing cost and misplaced priorities. One man had measured the bill and stated it plainly. The other had tried to talk past it. The country had watched both, and the difference, once seen clearly, proved very hard to forget. By this point, the pattern was locked in. Barack Obama had set a simple standard: look at the actual cost, look at the actual results, and ask whether the country was better off. Donald Trump and his allies had answered with the opposite approach: declare victory, dismiss criticism, and keep moving personal projects forward while the public bill kept growing. The longer both approaches stayed visible side by side, the clearer the difference became. The war did not produce the clean ending that had been advertised. Fuel prices stayed painful. Regional strikes continued. Shipping remained uncertain. Jobs had already been lost. Allies were still being asked for help while the administration questioned those same relationships. At home, public money continued flowing toward the East Wing ballroom, and the airport renaming deal kept advancing the president's commercial interests. The gap between the victory language and the daily reality refused to close. Obama never tried to win the noise contest. He didn't need to. He kept returning to the same core points. A diplomatic option that once contained the nuclear problem without war had been thrown out. A costly military campaign followed. The human and financial price was high, and the strategic results still looked incomplete. He had resisted this path before. Looking at the results, he suggested the reasons for that resistance still made sense. He tied it to a larger warning: when American power drops any real standard of decency and example, the damage spreads far beyond the battlefield. The other side stayed consistent. Victory was still claimed. Control was still asserted. Criticism was still treated as weakness, but every new cost, every new disruption, and every new story about taxpayer money moving toward personal priorities made the victory narrative harder to defend. The more they insisted everything was under control, the more the accumulating evidence made that insistence look disconnected from what people were actually experiencing. That was the lasting damage. Not one dramatic blow-up, but a steady, visible contradiction that refused to go away. One side kept measuring the bill and asking what had been gained. The other side kept performing strength while personal projects advanced. Once enough people saw both at the same time, the difference stopped being a matter of opinion. It became a matter of record. In the months that followed, the moment kept coming back. New costs brought it back. New questions about the war's progress brought it back. New details about public money and private benefit brought it back. Obama's calm timeline acted like a fixed reference point. Claims of historic success had to stand next to the actual expenses and losses. The other was calmly pointing at the growing bill and asking why it kept getting larger while the results stayed messy and incomplete. That was the real force of the moment, not a viral insult, not a staged confrontation, just a quiet former president putting the record in chronological order while the current one kept insisting the record didn't matter. The more the administration claimed victory, the more Obama's simple timeline made the victory look hollow. And once the gap between the claims and the actual cost became visible, it became very hard for anyone paying attention to unsee it. The war was supposed to be over, the cost said otherwise, and Obama made sure the country heard both sides of that sentence. While the war kept generating real costs and the victory claims kept getting louder, another story was moving quietly through Washington and Florida, and it made the whole picture look even worse. Donald Trump's personal projects were advancing fast. Congress was officially in recess, but the real work continued behind the scenes. Senate Republicans pushed forward a reconciliation package that included $1 billion for security features tied to the East Wing ballroom. This was the same ballroom that had been publicly sold with a clear promise it would cost taxpayers not a dime. Private donors would cover it. Patriots would step up. That was the line. Now the bill language told a completely different story. Taxpayers were being put on the hook for above ground and below ground security features connected to the president's personal construction project. At the same time, another deal was being locked in. Palm Beach International Airport was moving toward a name change: Donald J. Trump International Airport. Trump's private company had already secured the trademark.